joining us for this afternoon's conversation on Sin Padres ni Papeles featuring Professor Canizales. So excited. My name is Kim Tabari, and I'm the External Affairs Director at the University of Southern California's Equity Research Institute. ERI produces data-driven analysis and rigorous research, reconvening, engages strategic collaborations, and models effective, sustainable, racially just research centers. I would like to take a moment to recognize that California is home to Native nations on whose land we are living, and acknowledge that USC is located on Tonga land. We acknowledge that the land we reside on was taken by a settler colonial society that exploited native, immigrant, migrant, and enslaved people, stealing labor, knowledge, and skills to build what we now call California. As we recognize and acknowledge this history, we must also grapple with what it means to live on stolen land. Understand our role and responsibilities as guests on Native American homelands, and be committed to supporting the struggle for Native nation sovereignty and self-determination. Let's take a minute to settle in, honor the land, by placing both feet on the ground, and just taking 3 intentional breaths. Thank you for that. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the USC Department of Sociology, the Center for Latino and Latinx Studies, the Department of American Studies, and and the Leaving Institute for the Humanities. I want to also add that we do have books on deck for purchase at the end of our conversation, and there will be a signing by the author after as well. So please stay and enjoy that. So we're here to celebrate the publication of Professor Canizales, am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. Canizales' new book, published by the University of California Press just last month. Clap it up for that. We also have an amazing panel whose expertise and backgrounds are related to migration, immigrant inclusion, and transformational change in our communities and activism. So let's meet this amazing panel. First, Professor Canizales is a Berkeley Assistant Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative. Over the last decade, Stephanie has focused her work on migration and coming of age of unaccompanied children from Central America and Mexico in both California and Texas. Through her research and writing, Stephanie explores the role of immigration policy in shaping the everyday lives of migrant children and their families, how immigrants and the communities they arrive to either make or remake one another mutually, and immigrants' articulation of success and well-being within an increasingly unjust U.S. society. And we've seen some of that play out in the news lately. Our other panelist is Victor Narro, the project director of the UCLA Labor Center. See, we do work with UCLA, as well as a core faculty for the UCLA's Department of Labor Studies and the UCLA School for Law Public Interest Law program. He's a nationally renowned expert on immigration rights and low-wage workers. Victor has been involved with immigrant rights and labor issues for almost 40 years. An author himself, an activist whose work spans decades, he's authored 5 books. His latest publication is The Activist Spirit Towards a Radical Solidarity. And we held a webinar for that last February of last year. Our other panelist is Professor Susan Coutin from USC Irvine, Professor of Criminology, Law and Society and Anthropology. Her research has examined social, political, and legal activism surrounding immigration issues, particularly immigration from El Salvador to the United States. She has also written 5 books. What is 5 the magic number here? She has also written 5 books and another one in press. She's recently co-authored the book Legal Phantoms, Executive Relief on the Haunting Failures of the U.S. Immigration Policy, published by Stanford University Press this year. Our beloved and lastly, our beloved moderator today.
Say it one more time.
Lastly, our beloved moderator today is Professor Jody Vallejo, who is an associate professor of sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity. She's also the ERI's associate director. Her research focuses on immigrant inclusion and mobility across generations. She's the author of Barrios, The Burbs, The Making of Mexican-American Class, published by Stanford Press. And her next book, The Latino Elite, Why Giving Back Isn't the Answer to Inequality, will be published by University of California Press shortly. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing Professor Canizales' latest work, which is beautifully displayed on the screen in this thought-provoking book. She follows the journeys of migrant youth in LA and documents their experiences in navigating unthinkable material and emotional hardship as they grow up and find agency and community in the U.S. I welcome everyone with open hearts and open minds to this conversation. I will pass it over to Professor Jody.
Thank you so much, Kim. Hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you all back here in person. Thank you so much to our amazing panel for being here, but most of all, Stephanie, thank you for writing this really incredible book that is written in such an engaging style while also being academic, and that's actually really hard to do. And not only is this book written in an engaging style that's also academic, it's also a book that's really important for policymakers as well. And you offer a number of policy prescriptions in the book. But in this beautifully written book in which your connection to the people that you study, your connection to your own mobility story and trajectory and familial history, and also your connection to Los Angeles, because ultimately this is where this book is embedded, really shines through. And I'd love to hear more from you about what you see as some of the most important contributions of this book. I think from my perspective, and also seeing this book evolve over time, is how much this book shifts the way scholars think about migration, who's migrating, who's coming to the United States. For so long, so much of the research was focused on male sojourners, male immigrants coming to the US to work. And then there was really this disruption in the field when people started to focus on women. And children were really seen as these passive people coming into the United States at, you hear the phrase at no fault of their own, brought here to the US by their parents, growing up American. These are, of course, the group of people that we think of as the dreamers in US society, kids who grow up, go to school, grow up in American institutions and connected to American institutions, grow up in family units. But you actually take all of that and kind of say, there's this other group of people that policy, immigrant inclusion and integration theory, and theories of migration completely discounts and overlooks. This very hidden population that is at the heart of the functioning of our economy in LA. And it is these unaccompanied youth that are coming in to the United States to work, leaving families behind, and making many of our clothes or working in the restaurants that we eat at. Tell us about why it was so important for you to study this group of youth, and what do you think is so important about your book? That's amazing. I already said that. I'm going to say it again.
Hi everyone, Stephanie Canizales. Something about being on this campus, I got my PhD here. It gives me heart palpitations, so it's gonna take me a few minutes to stop shaking. But I'm really grateful that you're all here. I'm really grateful that you are all interested in Sin Padres ni Papeles, which really started as a proposal for the Ford pre-doctoral. In my first year, I was applying for the pre-doctoral fellowship, and I wanted to study what I was calling non-matriculated undocumented youth. I came to USC really motivated by the undocumented youth movement, the immigrant rights movement. I took Victor Narro's class in my last year at UCLA and was really just thinking about what it means to be a young person forming an identity within a larger movement. I came to USC really wanting to study Central American youth in that space, and was being introduced to just a bunch of youth groups across Pico Union, downtown, Westlake, MacArthur Park, all of those neighborhoods. I was told that there was a group of young people that met, and I talk about this in the book. There's a group of young people that met on a Starbucks patio 2 hours a week, Friday nights. Just pull up and I'll introduce you, is what one of the group leaders told me. And in that meeting, I was expecting to find DACA it was like 2012, DACA aspiring youth, dreamer youth, people that were also embedded in institutions of higher education, and it turns out they were all Guatemalan, indigenous, garment workers in downtown. I was meeting them. I mean, I was 21, 22 at the time. They were 18, 19, 20. And they were telling me about the 5 or 8 years they'd spent prior working in the garment industry. And it just totally, like, I'm born and raised in LA. I love being from LA, and I just was shocked that I was sitting in front of a dozen young people who could talk about the abuse they experienced in the garment industry. That, we think garment industry exploitation, the fashion industry, fast fashion, all of these like child labor issues are in over there, wherever there is for you, like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Guatemala, but not in downtown LA. And I was just really struck by the fact that these young people had survived on their own, first in their families to migrate, or that they had a non-parent relative living in LA that didn't or couldn't take them in, so they remained unaccompanied. They came to the US unaccompanied and remained so as they were coming of age. I couldn't wrap my head around it, right? And this was, again, 2012, when we're talking about DACA off the back of multiple years of failed DREAM Act pushes. In 2012, I was talking about unparented. I remember Manuel was like, this term does not work. Unparented is not going to cut it, because they have parents. They're just not in the US. And then 2014 rolled around, and we had this huge unaccompanied minor crisis, right, at the border. About 70,000 kids were apprehended at the US-Mexico border in 2014. We're at about 149,000 annually apprehended at the US-Mexico border this year and in the last 3 years. So the crisis has magnified, and still we're only talking about certain pockets of unaccompanied or undocumented youth, right? I felt like, well, first I needed to write a book because that's what academics do, but I felt like I needed to tell this particular story to sort of blow the lid on what was really happening in LA, which I still love being from this city, but like, let's be honest. I felt like there was something about this group of youth that I needed to capture, the dual transitions as immigrants arriving to a new society and finding a way, but also kids developing their sense of self, finding their friends, establishing goals. Like, what is it to do those things that we all do, but in very protected school, household, friendship, sort of social spaces. And we have kids that are navigating those life transitions on their own. I think the greatest contributions of the book, I would say very humbly, is the focus on youth voice, youth decision making, and also using youth, instead of imposing sociological terms onto the process that I was observing, taking the terms that young people were using in everyday life to really frame an incorporation journey that included migration and coming of age side by side, and also tracked sure, the material things that make immigrants successful, that guide policy making, that sort of help us determine who deserves or doesn't deserve legal protection, but also the emotional process. And in that, trying to reframe what success means. And at the end of the book, I arrive at this idea of subjective success, right? That young people define for themselves, based on their starting points, what it means to be successful in adulthood. And oftentimes it isn't every single time. It wasn't a college degree. It wasn't home ownership. It was the ability to manage emotions. It was the ability to pay their bills, to take care of their families. So I think just staying really grounded in youth voice and youth storytelling helped me sort of tell this story in a way that I hope does justice to the young people I spent 6 years basically growing up with, right? And then also just reframe what immigrant incorporation looks like as we continue to study this population moving forward.
I think that's such an important contribution of your book, in particular the ways in which you weave the youth stories and narratives throughout the book to demonstrate this attention to youth voice and emotions, and to think about how incorporation looks differently because of the specific circumstances,
right.
The context of the city, the kind of work that youth do, the kind of connections they have back home to their family members,
Yeah.
how this shapes their experiences in the US, which is so different than the way we have traditionally thought about immigrant inclusion or immigrant incorporation. And Susan, you know, I know that this was something that was also really resonated with you, and you are an expert in this kind of work. You are an expert in Central American migration. You think a lot about the stories that people tell, how this melds with structure, the law, how it melds with movements. You've also been very active in social movements yourself. What do you think is one of the most, or a few of the most important contributions of this book? Like, what stands out to you as a scholar, but also coming from your perspective as someone who has been embedded in these communities for so long?
Sure, thank you. And can you hear me? First of all, thank you for letting me be here today and for being on this panel. It's really an honor to be here, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with this book, which is absolutely wonderful, to just echo what's already been said. I got my copy of the book right around Labor Day, and I was reading it right around Labor Day, and it was just striking as I was hearing the Labor Day, comments about honoring workers, and I was reading this book, and I was just thinking, these workers are not being celebrated in our public rhetoric the way that other workers are, right? So I think just one really important contribution of this book is the fact that Stephanie shows us the diversity of immigrant communities, right? It's really easy, and I think there's a tendency these days to generalize, like to say immigrants are blank, and fill that out in your own way, whatever your own views are. And one thing she does in this book is she disrupts our ability to do that, right? Like, she tells us about the differences between these youth. Not all the youth fare the same, right? Some of them have different experiences, right? She tells us about female youth, male youth. She tells us about indigenous Guatemalan youth, right? So like we're able to get a fuller sense of the immigrant population in the United States and a neglected component of that population. Another really important contribution that Stephanie also mentioned, but I want to highlight as well, is just to agree that the youth-centered approach that she adopts is really important. I think there's a tendency often for scholars to think about framing their work solely in terms of the academic literature. And obviously she does that quite effectively in the book. She engages the academic literature, but the importance that she places on youth's own voices, her key terms in this book, I don't know if you listed them all just now, but they're adaptation, orientation, perdition, and unburdening, but she gives us these terms in Spanish, and she tells us how the youth define these terms, and she gives us many examples throughout the book to really describe their sense of how, and their own almost theorization, for want of a better word, of their lives. And I think that that's really important for all scholars, to not just impose our own categories, to obviously place our work in conversation with the literature, but to think about those terms as well. this was also mentioned already too, emotions, the attention that you give to emotions in the book. We really get to know the people that you write about through the stories that you tell, and you're attentive to their emotions, you're attentive to the ways that emotions are embodied, the physical manifestations of some of the suffering that you describe in the book, right? Like people are getting headaches, they're getting pains, you know, they experience these emotions physically as well. Reading these accounts engages readers' emotions. I'll just say for myself as a reader, I can't say what other people would react, but just I really felt moved by the book, and I think that that's really important. And then care is another key contribution of the book. And this is like both a theoretical and almost a methodological and a substantive contribution. Like it spans everything.
Tell us more.
Well, I was really struck by the way that your book kind of embodies the principles of the agency that you talked about just now. And it's not really an agency, but the group that you talked about where they're meeting at Starbucks, they're talking, you know, and some of the other groups that you worked with throughout your study. That you yourself seem to embody those principles as you carry out the work. So she tells us how they wanted, an English class, so she creates one for them. You know, she gives people rides, you know, she waited. I mean, as researchers, we're often under pressure, right? Like, how many interviews have you done? You know, how's your recruitment of participants going, right? And she tells us in the book that when she first approached the group that through which she met most of her participants, she waited. She went to their meetings and she waited and she waited and she waited until they came to her and said, you know, and she told them she was a researcher, but she waited till they were ready to talk to her. Not everybody does that. That's a sign of care. Something that hasn't been mentioned is that there's a methodological appendix, which is quite candid. Not all researchers talk about the travails of their research the way that she does. I've already written to I co-direct a lab group at UCLA, and I've already written to them and said, we're going to be reading this methodological appendix because the students that I work with are hungry for the graduate students I'm talking about, but I'm sure undergraduates as well are hungry for the kind of account that you provide of your fieldwork, because you know you can have these kind of rosy colored glasses of everything's lovely and and you're very honest about the joys of your work and also some of the challenges. And I should stop talking because I have more to say, but I will cut myself off there. There's one more thing I want to say, but I'll save it for a future question.
No, thank you so much, Susan. And one of the things that you mentioned, I was hoping before I turn to Victor, if you could just briefly take us through like one of the people that you studied and became so close to, and kind of this adaptation process, this 4-part adaptation process that Susan mentioned.
Okay.
I'm putting you on the spot here, but I know you can do it.
Yeah, I can do it. I wrote a book about it. So one of the people that I really foreground in the book is Caleb, and I explain in the acknowledgments why Caleb is so important. He was the first person after 7 months of attending meetings that said he would let me interview him. He was the youngest person in the group. He arrived from Guatemala to Pico Union at the age of 14. His uncle, who was already living here, had sent money to Guatemala to help him in the migration journey. So when Caleb arrived, pseudonym, arrived to Los Angeles, he thought his uncle would take him in. His uncle was going through a separation, was planning to move to a different apartment, and Caleb was not welcome to join his uncle. Caleb had an older half-brother that lived in Pico Union that was estranged from him because of the falling out of the parents, and his older brother was just not interested in knowing who Caleb was or how he was. So I talk about this initial arrival in Los Angeles as one of disorientation. Young people feel both materially disoriented in that they don't know where to live, how to pay bills, what is going to happen to their physical bodies, but also emotionally disoriented by the betrayal of the people they thought would help them. So I track those material and emotional processes throughout the book. I talk in the book about how young people like Caleb came to understand, sometimes through passive learning, just over time, but also through being told directly, this is what people do here, how they come to experience orientación, to social groups, to community organizations, to where to find work and how work works. And orientation eventually leads into, for some people, material and emotional adaptación, where young people said, ya me adapté, I've already adapted, or me voy adaptando, I'm becoming adapted. I draw out a distinction for, again, material and emotional processes, that young people can experience material adaptación, but without meaningful social ties as adolescents and as immigrants. They can never become emotionally adapted. And I describe in a chapter on perdición, which doesn't translate well into English, because perdición is really emotional loss, a loss of self, a sense of future, which is really meaningful for adolescents and immigrants also broadly. But a process of, instead of saying like this immigrant is upwardly mobile or downwardly mobile, successful or not successful, I really try to draw attention to the mechanisms that cause some people to uptake certain behaviors that would be perceived as successful adaptation, or uptake behaviors like self-harm, drug addiction, enter into relationships they hope will provide relief but become abusive and more isolating, and create a sort of feedback loop of perdición, where to cope with the sadness and the loss, they do material things that put them in more vulnerable positions that they then try to cope with. So really drawing attention to the social lives of young people and how these social lives and emotional lives shape their lived everyday decisions and behaviors. So I track that desorientación, orientación, adaptación, or perdición in the book, and what it means when you're really trying to say, like, it's never ending. You don't become incorporated one day. You are constantly orienting, adapting, on the brink of perdition, coming back to it, right, as a lived reality.
And really, you could only come to these conclusions because you were so immersed in various different ways with people in these youth, in these various different contexts. And this brings me to you, Victor. It's your turn. You know, you've worked for so long in Los Angeles, again, in many different capacities. As a researcher and scholar, as an activist, you've worked with the most important and largest immigrant rights organizations in LA. Your work is grounded in MacArthur Park, one of the core areas in which Stephanie's respondents live their daily lives and work in their daily lives. Tell us more about, I want to hear more from you about the LA context, and also how representative you think this is of LA and kind of this LA context, but also what you think are the big contributions of Stephanie's book.
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me to this panel. And it's the first time I connected with Susan since I was at Chilla in the 1990s. So it's great to reconnect with Susan. And then I'm always grateful when, you know, I've been teaching 21 years at UCLA now, and I'm always grateful. I try to keep in touch with all my students as much as possible and track their journey. So proud of what Stephanie had done, remarkable journey, and to where she is right now. It makes me grateful. I hope she took one class with me, so I hope my class had a sprinkle of, later I poured a sprinkle into her journey, but I'm very grateful to be reconnected with her in this way, in a capacity. She's a professor now, and she came out with this awesome book. So, you know, MacArthur Park has been on the news lately in a negative way, right? Like the mayor and everybody's talking about criminalizing MacArthur Park again. Langers is making a big stink about MacArthur Park. So it's the talk rhetoric now is about getting rid of the street vendors, coming down hard on the homeless population of MacArthur Park. You know, the word undesirable is being used again. And I think MacArthur Park is always, I came to LA in 1992, most of my work, life has been near MacArthur Park. It just happens to be I work with the organizations that are right at MacArthur Park. So the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, back then when I worked there in the 1990s or early 2000s, we were 2 blocks away from MacArthur Park. The UCLA Labor Center, we're one of the few entities that are now on campus. Our work is at our MacArthur Park building, right across the street from the park, and it's being renovated now, so we're remote, but we're going to go back to our newly improved space in 2025. But we're right across the street from MacArthur Park. So I've done probably the last 25, 30 years, I've been a field observer of MacArthur Park because my work has been connected to that environment. I think MacArthur Park, what happens there is really a litmus test for how we handle a lot of the hardcore policies, the challenges that lie ahead in the city, not just with low-wage workers, but with people unhoused, with their housing issues, with all the, issues that impact humanity in Los Angeles. I think that way, and that's why it's unfortunate now that we're seeing MacArthur Park as like police and criminalization again. So my hope is, this book and this kind of information will get us to think differently about how we handle MacArthur Park. My work has been on low-wage workers, wage staff, labor exploitation in these industries. These are the industries that are highlighted in this book. These youth have been involved in. These are the industries where they have seen as the place where they're trying to survive. And the garment industry is highlighted through this book, but there's a lot of young people now at day labor corners too, looking for work. I was reading yesterday articles in preparation for this about Florida, how 15 or 16-year-olds have died on their first day of the job as day laborers. They were doing roofing work and they fell off and they died. But this happened around the country. The restaurant industry, you've seen in the back of the house. We go to the restaurant, we see the front of the house, we assume everything's okay, but the back of the house, you see a lot of these young people. And there's car wash. I've been really focusing a lot on the car wash industry, trying to improve labor standards. I talked to my colleagues at the Car Wash Worker Center. They say they have been seeing young people now, immigrant youth working at the car washes. So they in our system from that perspective. They're in these low-wage economies that benefit us in so many different ways. And as you go off further California, you see a lot of them are farm workers, or young people. These are the newly arrived migrant children that are working in the fields. These are the industries that like the essential workforce that provide so much for our comforts and needs. They saved our life during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we relied on these workers to provide for us while we were in shelter. I can tell you stories about garment workers. I do a lot of work in the garment industry. Garment workers I know died producing the PPE equipment for us. Car wash workers was essential workers. I know a lot of car wash workers that died during the pandemic. Day laborers, it was, they're not afforded protection when they go to work. And when you have a crisis like pandemic, they end up being the first fatalities of the crisis. But then many of them are working in unsafe working conditions. I think what this book does, it creates a layer of what Stephanie uses the term work primacy, because work becomes the center for the lives of these of these young immigrants. But then it really causes us to embrace a new economy of exploitation. When I talk to my colleagues about this book, and I talk to others about this issue, the Labor Center, we're starting to engage in child labor issues, and Jack is from the Labor Center is working with us on this. But it's hard to talk about it because we're talking about children. But I go, look, we gotta face it, we gotta embrace it, we gotta dive into it, because I think this causes us to rethink how we view humanity from the immigration perspective. Because there was a time period, decades ago, when our immigration policy was built along the concept of family unity. It was about like, wherever we move forward, you gotta keep the family together. The family's gotta be able to be together. Children need to be with their parents. Parents need to also petition for their other relatives. It was based on family unity. I came to this country after the 1965 immigration law. They embraced family unity and lifted up quotas in many countries. That's my family came to this country under that system, and it was all of us together. It was not like some of us go and then try to bring the others. We've shifted away from that, and I think if we look closely at what's happening to these children, it might cause us to rethink our humanity of how we do it. Because today we're talking about enforcement, border, separating, children, putting children in cages, separating children from their parents. That's been immigration policy for the past few years. And then this happened under the Obama administration. We try to distinguish between good immigrants and bad immigrants, which has created so much harm to so many families. Our health and human services system is supposed to take care of all children, regardless of your immigration status. They have lost track of 83,000 migrant children. They don't know where they are. They acknowledged it a few weeks ago. They lost track of them. And this is supposed to be the department is supposed to look for the well-being of children. But the reality is they look for the well-being of children who are native born. And they don't put that same kind of emphasis on undocumented migrant children. So they just let them go and they don't track them. And now we lost them. We don't know where they are, 83,000 documented cases. But it's larger when you think about the children in this book who come and not apprehended at the border and come into this system, into this country. So I think this book, it's a reminder of why the way we struggle with this issue of unaccompanied migrant children and the way we deal with it is really where we're at now as far as our humanity looking forward, immigration policy. So thank you so much for this book. And I teach a class on emotional intelligence at UCLA, because I think emotions is part of your academic experience. It cannot just be all intellectualizing and analysis. And my children love that class because they are allowed to not just embrace and validate their emotions, but develop their emotional intelligence. Because I think emotions is part of the academic experience. And you cannot be a human being if you don't embrace emotions. And I tell my students it's good to be emotional and analytical at the same time. So thank you so much for this contribution.
Thank you so much, Victor. I really appreciate you bringing in this idea of rethinking our immigration policy systems, rethinking our structures in the U.S. to account for the realities of immigration today. And one of the things, Stephanie, that I think I just want to lift up from what Victor's mentioning, and I'd love for you to respond a little bit about, is this idea of how your work really turns how we think about youth and children's roles in our society on its head. And I have an 11-year-old, well, she'll be 11 tomorrow. Oh my God, I don't even know. You know Lulu, she's a little firecracker. I cannot imagine her working in this environment, an environment where work becomes central to her life in a new country. And many people cannot imagine, like Victor was saying, that this is actually occurring and existing in our city as we drive through downtown LA or through the Garment District, or even as we go to eat at our favorite restaurants. So tell us a little bit more about what unaccompanied migrant youth are doing when they come to LA, and why work becomes, and how work becomes so central to their experience. And what do you think this, well, we'll go there later.
So one of the things, I mean, there's so much to unpack with what you said, Victor. One of the things that I really struggle with, especially with the increasing attention on unaccompanied children being found, since last February when the New York Times supposedly exposed migrant child labor, there's been so much attention on unaccompanied migrant children who are being trafficked. And I struggle a lot with, once you read this book, you will know, I struggle a lot with the traffic framing as being the umbrella that then every child that finds work in the US fits under. Whether they legally are classified as trafficked children ignores whether they are experiencing their labor as trafficking, or whether they experience it as an extension of the thing they were already doing before migration, and a part of their sense of self, their role in their family and in their community, and their expression of care within networks of care that have been developed across decades in light of the failure of origin country governments extending care to citizens, but instead persecuting, repressing, marginalizing, neglecting people in Central America and Mexico. Many of, if not all of the children that I interviewed and spent time with were workers in their countries of origin. They came to the US expecting to work, hoping they would go to school also, but all of the people that I portray in this book expected that they would find work in the US. I develop a concept called an emergent frame of reference, where young people, once they were in the US, they realize, oh, kids don't do that here, and then the sort of consciousness of what they were doing as not the kid thing emerged from their time in the US. They were going to work, not alongside other kids like they were in El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala. They were going to work alongside adults who were laboring on behalf of their children in a factory, at a restaurant, at a car wash, and the sort of emerging awareness that the kids' role in the US context is different. Again, that has both material consequences and emotional consequences on how children then understand their roles. I'm losing track of the question just because I have so much to say about this framing on labor trafficking. But what work primacy highlights for me is how unaccompanied young people first rely on work and workplaces to survive, right? They need to work to pay the rent. I talk in the book about how a lot of my participants said the same thing. Either I pay rent or I buy food. Either I pay rent or I go to school. There were constant negotiations young people were making at 11, 12, 13 years old. They needed to work to survive, but the conditions of labor then started to structure their time and impact their physical bodies, where work became the only thing they could do, despite any aspiration they had for education or developing community or dating or whatever it may be that young people do as they're coming of age. So the idea of work primacy as being a self-perpetuating, a self-reinforcing concept where the body starts to wear so much that young people can't actually sit in a classroom, even if they have 3 hours at the end of the day to do so. Or their wages are so low that they have perpetually bloody noses and they can't get help at a clinic, right? So work becomes the space that they occupy, spend most of their waking hours, but then the institution that shapes the rest of their lives. And I am 1000% opposed to child labor, but I think our response to child labor in the context of migration needs to account for the fact that young people are experiencing their work in different ways that aren't always forced or coerced or trafficking in their understanding of it. So if we are going to enforce compliance or take punitive approaches, that ignores the full network of the full care network that children are the hubs of, right? Or even the self-concept that young people have as responsible, as I talk about in the last chapter of the book, responsible, emotionally mature, caring, honoring their families by doing the work that they do. So what are we going to offer young people so that they can still embody those features or those characteristics of their lives without just pulling the rug from under them, right? We need to have a solution that sort of fills that gap. And I propose, as you're saying, filling the gap means taking an approach of care within HHS or within any other government institution so that kids don't have to be the caregivers, that they can be the recipients of care.
And I really appreciate you also, Stephanie, because you've been working with our government organizations like Health and Human Services to try to bring this research and this perspective into our institutions. But your comments make me want to know from Susan and Victor, like what does Stephanie's book tell us for this moment that we're in right now? How does it help us meet this moment where we're on the verge of another presidential election? Everything you heard in the last debate from that one person's mouth was immigration. You've we've got an opportunity, possibly, that might present itself, or we maybe have more and more negative, disparaging political rhetoric and policies that might come out from an administration. What does Stephanie's work tell us about the current moment, both in terms of policy and about the immigrant rights movement? Susan, I'm going to start with you.
It tells us a lot, and I really wish that we could have a different panel. I mean, I love this panel, but it would be really interesting to have a different group of people reacting to your book, like some of our political leaders, right? I don't know what they would say in response, but anyway, there's so much here that is really important for us to think about in terms of policy. One is a key point that you make in the book by beginning the stories of the young people in their countries of origin, as you just described. They come to the United States with certain goals in mind, certain prior experiences, but part of that story that you tell, it's not just about them, it's also about the United States and the role that the United States plays in displacing people in the first place that leads them to come here. So I think that's one thing that I think is really important to understand when we look at immigration policy, is that the United States plays a role in people's countries of origin in the first place. And with that, once that's acknowledged, then it puts a whole different light on the question of, well, what should we do? Another really important point that you make in the book, and you touched on it just now, but I think there's a quote somewhere in the book, I don't have it in front of me, but you make the point that migration is an act of care. Mm-hmm. And I think people don't think about that. If we think about the ways that, and maybe many people probably do, but I mean, in just general discourse, immigration is seen, especially the kind of immigration that you're writing about, as a transgression, right? It's seen as, it's even seen as a movement from one country to another, which obviously it is. However, this notion of care, that people migrate, they make sacrifices. These young people are showing care for their families by migrating and coming to this country in an effort to reintegrate themselves with their families from a distance, in order to provide support for their siblings or their parents or sometimes their community, right? So I think that's a really important point too. And then as well, one thing that's really valuable about this book is that, to echo what Victor was saying about, this can show us new things about humanity. And this is really hard, I think, for researchers and writers to do. But you effectively write about many people in the book who are positioned differently without either idealizing them or demonizing them. And I think when we idealize people or we demonize people, it's hard for us, both of those processes can erase their humanity, right? And I think you show really, you talk about perdición, the young people who end up struggling, as well as those who succeed, but you write about both with an empathy that we don't necessarily read it and blame those people. Do you know what I mean? We're able to situate the outcomes within the circumstances they're in. And likewise, a group that it would have been possible to blame are the relatives in the United States who receive the individuals, the youth who come from their countries expecting to live with their siblings or expecting to live with an uncle or something like that. And often it doesn't work out. And it would be possible to write an account that blames those individuals. And I think this is part of your youth-centered analysis, is that you show how it is that those family members who are receiving youth want to help them. However, their own circumstances are often precarious, right? They might not have papers. They might also be working at low-wage jobs or have certain issues going on in their families. And therefore, it's hard for them just to take on another person. And so you write about those people's situation with great empathy too. And I think that's hard to do. Like, it would have been possible to, see them as the culprit somehow, and you don't. Right. And I don't think the youth do either, is what I get. And so I think you're echoing that. So I don't know if I directly addressed your question, Jody, but I think those are some things that I take away that would really enrich our understanding of immigration policy.
do you want to respond to that?
Can
Or-
I
go ahead.
make a comment?
Yeah.
So one of the key features to know about this book, if you're just starting to read it, is that I spent 6 years with young people who were not apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border. They didn't get taken into custody. They didn't get transferred to a sponsor. So when you're reading things in the news, it's typically about young people who have moved through federal channels of custody and release. The 85,000 kids, and this is on top of like the 30,000 from the year before and the 50-something from the year before that go missing. They go administratively missing, but they don't go missing in the reality of their lived experience. And I've been working with HHS now and with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is responsible for the care and transfer of custody of kids. What happens a lot of time is, even though I'm not studying kids that were apprehended, I do want to put what we see in the news in the context of this book also. When kids disappear, they go missing, a lot of times it's that the relative that they were given to, the custody of the child was handed over to someone who couldn't actually take them in, and there was an agreement with another relative in another state, or maybe tensions arise in the household where the child has to go somewhere else, and there's like sort of informal transfers that the government is not aware of. But the US government says what a good sponsor is, and on paper that person will sign the kid out, right, of custody, but they're not actually willing to take care of the child. And I appreciate you pointing out chapter 2, the context of arrival, which I don't focus on city, I focus on households and the household dynamics. And I think it is really important to emphasize that most of the time long settled relatives want to take these kids in, but that person is in such a precarious position, or like Caleb's uncle was going through his own life thing and couldn't take in this child. And that sort of sets like a cascading of a domino effect for the rest of that kid's time in the US, because now they're not only migrating with the trauma of being unaccompanied, but they have to stay unaccompanied. And that's different from, I think, the children that we assume are placed with a sponsor, and then that sponsor sort of guiding their incorporation or integration.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to this dialogue and your question, you know, I don't have, like, in the federal level, like, whatever happens, you know, Congress, it's so polarized in this issue. I tend to focus on local, because I think Los Angeles, what we do locally can impact the national direction and the debate. You know, we created a Welcome Coalition, you know, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, Cadesian, Immigrant Defenders. Many organizations came together in partnership with city and county to welcome all the buses that Governor Abbott was sending our way. But we created a strong coalition, and we created wraparound services. You know, some of them were migrant children, some of them were adults, you know, but they came here, they were bused here from Texas, and we were receiving them, but we created a wraparound services for every individual. I think Los Angeles, with this kind of book and all the stories here, and, you know, you lay out a lot for us to take into, you know, here in Los Angeles, in City Hall and LA County, but also all the groups involved with immigrant rights work and labor. We can come together and create something in Los Angeles that can then show the rest of the nation that we can do this the right way, and we can figure out how to embrace these children, figure out how to, you know, we come a long way in Los Angeles addressing the exploitation of labor in these industries. We still have a lot to go, but we come a long way. But you know, this is a chance for us to create thoughtful analysis and policy about this issue, because many of these lives took place here in the heart of the city, and this is, you know, maybe an opportunity for us to come together and create something in Los Angeles that then can be looked at from a national perspective. We should still try to do everything we can in the federal and Congress, but I'm not going to wait for them. You know, there's a lot of stuff we can do in Los Angeles, I think, and I think this book gives us an opportunity for that.
I really appreciate you saying that, because it's so important that we as researchers bring our research outside of these halls of academia and actually into the communities that we're studying for real social change, and to work in collaboration with community orgs, with activists on the ground who are also trying to make change every day in so many different contexts. And I love this idea of the possibility that LA can serve as this model, as it has before,
Right.
around immigrant rights for the broad swath of immigrants that are here trying to work and live in our society and our community. Before I open it up for questions from the audience, Stephanie, tell us just a minute about how these youth that you studied find peace and joy, because it's not simply a story of the kind of, it's not just this story of loss and struggle.
No.
This is also a story of finding your place in a new society.
Yeah.
How do they do that?
Yeah. Can I piggyback on one thing that Victor just said?
Yes.
I think this idea that local policy and program making, coalition building can be a model, can be a change maker locally, but then be a model federally or even across the state, is one of the exact points that I'm trying to make in the incorporation framework that I'm proposing, the disorientation, orientation, adaptation, partition, all of that, right? That those things are experienced locally. We talk about incorporation and are people incorporated or not? Are they successfully integrated into US society or not? As if it is like a monolithic, it's happening and either you are in this category or that one. But if you think about disorientation, even disorientation to orientation, it happens in the very neighborhoods, in the workplace, in the schools that young people or immigrants broadly are participating in. So if I were to take these exact people and drop them into Kansas, I would have written a different book, even if the framework were the same, right? Because what they were incorporating too is even just because of the racialization or because of the imposition of illegality and the threat of deportation, the young people in this book are not going to Hollywood and Santa Monica and Orange County. They're in Pico Union, they're very here. So I think change is also, it needs to happen here. And then whatever we learn on a sort of fundamental level, that then gets taken to the next place, and the coalition needs to look different in a different place, right? So even the federal model, all of my work with HHS is like, your federal model is trash. Like, it's not working because people don't experience post-release life. Children don't experience post-release life from federal custody to sponsor custody in one single way, where you give them the same set of services in any given community, and it's going to be helpful. It's just not realistic to the human experience. Thank you.
Just one very brief minute on
Joy. So, yes,
peace,
thank you.
joy.
Thank you. Yes, there are narratives, there are experiences of joy. I wouldn't say peace, but of joy and resilience throughout the book. And I think it is found in the stepped nature of this process. Young people who felt disoriented and then talked about orientación, they experienced like a moment of success or a feeling of accomplishment. And then when it moved to adaptación, they experienced success and accomplishment. And then young people who were in a state of perdición, who were oriented to meaningful ties and then adapted, there are stories of overcoming and resilience and agency in action with reward at the end throughout the book. The final chapter of the book is on success, how young people define success as immigrants and as young people coming of age. And those stories really talk about contributions, like looking at a garment that is sewn and saying, I made that, right? Like people on the red carpet, I contribute to LA culture. I constructed that building on the corner of 6th and Union, right? Like young people being able to point to things that they accomplished materially, being able to keep the promises they left to the families they left behind. or they made to the families they left behind. They built a home, they helped start a business. The younger siblings didn't have to migrate as unaccompanied children. They finished school. The young person in LA never got to finish school, but the younger sibling did. Those are like experiences of joy, and they aren't things that make someone deserving of legal protection in the US, right? But they feel deserving of claiming success subjectively, right? One thing that I emphasize, I talk about in this book, but is really the focus of my next book, which comes out next summer, is that success for a lot of these young people is the ability to turn around and tell a recently arrived person, or even someone that's long settled, that is maybe in a state of perdición or loss, how to become oriented and adapted. Taking any sort of lived, learned experience and giving it back to the community. So you can tell Jody was my advisor. Giving back becomes a central feature of resilience and joy. And when young people are able to complete that transaction, right? Like, I have resource, skill, knowledge, and I'm going to transfer it to someone else, then is like, I did it, right? Like, I did something meaningful here. And I think I looked for those things throughout the 6 years that I was doing this research.
Which again speaks to this point that I love. I'm going to steal that from you, Susan, about idealizing or dehumanizing the people that you're studying and thinking about as you write and contribute to research and the way that we think about movements and communities. I'd love to take a question or two from the audience if anybody has them. Oh, there's so many here. Well, I'm going to first say hello to our director, Manuel Pastor, who's here in the audience in the front row, and give him, Manuel, please ask the first question.
Thanks. And first, two compliments and then a question. For several of us in this audience, it's been a joy to watch your professional development, both with this book, with this presentation, and with your ability, after Jody asks a question, to decide to answer the question you wish that she had answered. That is a professional skill. Way to go.
Like any good academic over here.
I think I learned that from you.
The second thing I want to lift up, particularly those of you in doing dissertations or books, the thing that hasn't come up is that this book is readable, highly readable. And there's a sense sometimes in the academy that being serious means being impenetrable and accessible, and not speaking the language of the subjects, but the language of the experts. So I urge you to read this with that in mind. The question I have for you is the following. From the research and the writing, what did you learn about yourself? And how did you develop? I just finished the book coming up this month, not next summer. But it's about the Salton Sea region. And one of the things I learned was that I went in thinking there were good guys and bad guys. And it turned out there were a lot of good people in a bad structure with things going wrong and conflicts that were reasonable. So I learned a lot more about grace and generosity in my analysis and in my writing. What did you learn from doing this book?
That's such a good question. I learned, everything I know is in the pages of this book. So I learned all of this. And then I learned about myself that I am a deeply emotional person. And when you read things so much, it like desensitizes. Like, I feel at times really desensitized to the things I read about immigrant community suffering because I've been reading about it since 2007. And the story, it takes something really egregious for me to like feel an emotional response. I write in the acknowledgments actually about a conversation I had with Manuel, who was on my dissertation committee that I really struggled to sit and write this book. I focused instead on writing a few articles about education and work primacy and organizations in the very academic way that allowed me to feel analytical as opposed to emotional. Writing this book was, I can literally open and read any like 5 words in a row and I know exactly what I'm talking about and it takes me there, and I remember writing it and revising it. Writing this book was really emotional and made me really think about the people as people. And I was telling Susan the group the other day that one of my reviewers wrote that the author is empathetic almost to a fault, that it stripped away the effectiveness of the sociology. And I was like, perfect, love it, I did it, you know? But I think I thought of emotion as weakness in this space, kind of like what you're saying, but it is, I think, my greatest strength that it makes me want to cry talking about this book.
I don't know how many times you called me up crying.
I've cried a million times in my life, and Jody was there for about 750,000 of those times. But yeah, I think like it's okay to express empathy. It's okay to feel things as you're writing. It's okay, and I wouldn't have wanted to write any other book.
Other questions? Go ahead, Kim.
Hi, my name is Michael. Thank you to all the panelists, especially Stephanie. It's really inspiring to hear about your process. I'm a journalism student, and I'm really interested in telling like longer form ethnographic stories and also doing more participatory reporting. But I'm also like always grappling with like how to do so ethically and responsibly, like how to immerse yourself in a community, but also make sure that you're telling the narrative the way that the people that you're researching or learning from want their stories to be told. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to like how you navigated any like ethical challenges. Were there any moments where you really had to be intentional and mindful about how you were, collecting their stories and also building trust and relationships with these children?
Yeah. As Susan brought up and we touched on a couple of times, I went into the first group thinking I was going to do, I'm here to do research and people are going to want to talk to me because I'm here to do research. And it took 7 months of just being there. And I realize this is probably not an investigative reporter's, I don't think you would spend 6 years sitting with people listening to their stories to be able to tell one story. But it took a really long time, and I write about it in the methodological appendix, and I actually elaborate on it in a recent UC Press blog interview that I did. So I would encourage you to read there. But one of the things I think is really important is understanding the pace, the rhythm of the space that you're in. And it is, people are not going to accommodate you, and the space will not change for you to be able to extract the thing that you want from it. You really have to sit. And I talk about how uncomfortable it was for me for 7 months to be essentially ignored by people. But I was invited and I kept going. I talk a lot in the blog that I mentioned about how I at times put my own, I don't know if this was the right thing to do, I put my own friends' plans, family things to keep with the pace of my participants. If there was something happening and I said I was going to be there, I was there. It didn't matter whose birthday, who texted, it didn't matter. I was going to be there because I said that I was going to be there. And that to me, it was making sure that my life didn't, I wasn't treating my life as an exception to their reality. I was actually embedded in the rhythm of their lives, of my participants' lives. And I I don't know, I would say just read the methodological appendix. I talk about how I treated my interview guide. I talk about how I sometimes wrote notes, but sometimes I waited to be in the car to voice record. You just have to really pay attention to the space you're in, I think, to be able to build rapport and trust, and that's where the most honest stories come from, I think.
Thank you so much for your time and speaking on this issue and for really all of your responses. I was wondering how all of us in Los Angeles can work to support the children experiencing desorientación, but not support the child labor industry, and how you sort of work to support the child but not them in this industry, and especially you talked about how them being in the back of restaurants or things that we don't necessarily see in the front of the house. And I was wondering if there's any telltale signs you can you've noticed that sort of say, oh, that this is definitely a place that's supporting child labor, and how we can work to not support that but also work towards supporting our children in this space. Thank you.
Do I get one more question for you, Ms. or you?
I'll answer that one, or I'll forget it. I think we can assume that child labor is just threaded into everything that we do in our everyday lives. And when we feel like we're getting a deal on something, it's probably because, if not a child, someone else was deeply exploited to give us those prices as consumers. In order to both advocate for children and to end child labor and the exploitation of vulnerable laborers broadly, we need to be engaged in movements constantly. Labor movements, and I think as much as I appreciate people being activated by the injustice of a child working, children are working in conditions that adults have long been working for decades and decades in LA and across the country and across the globe. And if we are outraged, yes, we should be outraged that 7, 8, 9-year-old children are experiencing those work conditions, but we should be mutually outraged that an adult, any human body, would be in those conditions. And I think that takes consistent engagement. It takes being the squeaky wheel over and over and being involved in the coalitions that organize around any set of injustice against people. I have been arguing for the past couple of maybe the past year, a la George Sanchez, who was also on my committee, that unaccompanied children, there is a Venn diagram with foster youth, right? Like there is a sort of meeting with children of incarcerated parents. There are other groups of youth that share overlap with the unaccompanied kids that I described in this book. And even if we can't get people to rally behind undocumented children because of their legal status, there are other groups of US-born kids or other groups of workers that we can advocate for and organize around, that there will be some kind of spillover effect into the lives of people I portray in this book, and the young people that come up behind them. So I think that is both the mechanism by which we can intervene on desorientación and hasten the orientación process, and also just improve the conditions of all people that share spaces with the young people I describe in this book.
Hello.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Ulises. You can call me Uli. I'm on the PhD program in sociology. When doing this research, I was wondering, you said it was like 6 years worth of work. Was there any moments where I guess you found an area or a subject that you wanted to continue studying, but maybe you thought you didn't want to diverge, or it was taken away from the story that you wanted to tell? I haven't read the book, but I will. What's the subject of it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think one of the strengths of the ethnographic method is it's all valid because it's all in the field. I worked to sort of organize the release of the data into the world, but I was always collecting data because my participants were at church and at work and trying to go to school and at the community garden and taking bus, like I was capturing all of it. I think for me it was just a matter of like, when do I write about the church experience and when do I write about the education experience, and then the book sort of brings it all together. I do remember Jody told me that I needed and I keep telling my students at Berkeley now, like, you need a document on your desktop that is just ideas, and anything that doesn't go in the work you're doing, you still store it. And then when you have time later, you just cherry pick that idea out, and that's the next thing you're working on. But I never felt like as an ethnographer, I wasn't able to like get the thing, because all of it counted in trying to tell the story of the youth I was researching.
Daisy?
I feel like they should get questions.
Stephanie, congratulations on this amazing work. And I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit more on how you address this very important tension that has been discussed already, has been come up in the Q&A. And I also didn't like the New York Times article you mentioned. It rubbed me the wrong way, because these kids need to work to survive.
Right.
Like, you can't just take their jobs away. You can't criminalize them or criminalize their situation, and then what are they going to do? And so there's a sense that they need to survive somehow. They don't have these support systems. They're not able to get government benefits directly unless you have NGOs supporting them. So there's that tension there. The other tension that I saw, and this has to do a lot with Bolivian children who have migrated, who are organizing in Argentina, for example, and they're advocating for themselves, saying, this is our agency.
Mm-hmm.
We work because we have agency. And so I know that our notions of childhood and child development are in tension with that agency. The assumption is that you can only have agency after 18.
Right.
Otherwise, you're being exploited, manipulated, deceived. And so, given these conflict tensions that you've probably been grappling with all this time, you mentioned briefly that your solution was to create new avenues of care so that the children can be taken care of. Mm-hmm. Can you, given how you know how the government is working, you see how their solutions are not very effective, what would, in the ideal world, what kind of program or policy would you propose that takes into account children's needs, their agency, without criminalizing their situation or hardships, but also giving them some breathing air to be able to like not have to make their whole life's work if they don't want to?
Yeah, I think I now think about this issue in, unfortunately, but fortunately, the way the book is organized, right? I think about what policies we can implement at the point of displacement and migration, at the point of arrival, and at these various stages of children's incorporation process. So, of course, opening up avenues for family migration. If we are going to maintain the structure where children are dependent on adults in the U.S. context, we need to make it so that children have adults that can care for them, whether that is, whatever that looks like. I argue in the conclusion of the book that that also includes providing legalization for the long settled relatives, right? So that when new children come, if the US government doesn't want to support undocumented, recently arrived, unaccompanied children, okay, their long settled relatives have been here for 10, 15, 20 years. Provide legalization, some kind of legal protection where the private individual can then create that network of care. I'm very much aligned with the idea of youth organizing, empowering, funding, or local organizations to get the lived experiences of, my participants, they're in their 30s now. They were unaccompanied children before. We're a decade into the crisis. They're older, young adults, unaccompanied youth who can speak to what would have made a difference, right? Including their voices would be really useful in developing solutions that are community-based, right? Regionally positioned, and also takes into account the goals that young people have for themselves. So I think about like tiered responses And then the shifting responsibility between the origin countries and the US, but always the US because we're the ones that sort of puppeteer the origin countries.
I think we're out of time for questions, yeah?
Yes. Yep.
I just do want to say thank you to the folks that are here that are probably have had this unaccompanied migrant experience. I know at least one or two of you, so thank you for being here. And I'll pass it back to Jody.
Thank you for that, Kim. Before we end, Susan and Victor, one comment from each of you in 45 seconds. Go.
I've got it. Oh, do you want me to go first? Sorry. I'm jumping to the gun. My comment is, I wrote down a bunch of quotes from the book that I really loved, and I want to put forward one of them that I almost want to frame and put up someplace. And what it is, it's on page 256. The culpability for trauma does not lie with the individual. And I think that we could take that away and apply that to so many different contexts where the traumatized individual gets blamed for the trauma, and that's or the impacts of the trauma. And your book really challenges that, and I want to. That's like a motto almost. The culpability. You put it so well. The culpability for trauma does not lie with the individual. So there's my final comment.
I mean, just, from this whole conversation, what came up right now is, children and teenagers, they want to be children and teenagers,
Yeah.
And we're taking that away from them. They may be older than others, participants in this book, but that goes with them for the rest of their lives, I can assure you, because I have my own migration journey. I witnessed a lot as a child, and I still relive that. It stays with you. And they were taken, to be jumped from, you're not having adolescence, you're being thrown into adulthood, that will have an impact for them for the rest of their lives. And which is just, I think the starting point for us is we cannot let this happen to children, regardless of your immigration status. We cannot let this happen to children in this country.
I want to thank all of you so much for joining us and providing so many important insights about this brilliant book that I hope allows all of us to think more deeply about this idea that migration is an act of care, this idea that we have to center the people that we study in our analyses and their humanity as we think about being researchers ourselves or working within movements, and that we have to make humanity central to our immigration policies as we think about making change going forward. I want to just take a second to thank all of our staff at ERI. Stand up for me, give a wave. Deborah, where are you? Kim, Tabari, Lauren, Vanessa, Paris, who's not here, Lupe, Alex, Rhonda, who's also not here with us today. And of course, Manuel, thank you. We have our sociology staff over here in the room. Give them a big round of applause. And we cannot wait to see your next book, Stephanie, which is coming out by Stanford University Press next summer. Everybody please stay, speak with Stephanie. She'll sign your books. We have our bookseller here. And thank you again to our amazing panelists and to all of you.
Thank you.